What if the most feared queen of the ancient world was not a monster created by her enemies, but a ruler who committed acts so disturbing that even her own scribes tried to erase them? This question hangs like a blade over every surviving fragment of her story, because the deeper you dig, the more you realize how little the official records want you to know. Her reign was not built on legend. It was built on an architecture of fear so precise that entire kingdoms whispered her name long after. Her empire crumbled. But behind that terrifying reputation lies something far stranger, something history has never fully confessed. The woman we call the Assassin Queen did not rise to power by accident. Her ascent was shaped by betrayals inside the palace, foreign invasions pressing at her borders, and a court so venomous that a single misstep meant immediate annihilation. Every chronicler hints at the same pattern. She learned early that survival demanded brutality, and once she mastered that logic, she wielded it with a clarity that unsettled even her closest allies. Yet what continues to puzzle scholars is how she transformed from a politically cornered monarch into the orchestrator of a system designed to break her enemies before they ever reached the throne room. The more you study her methods, the more an uneasy truth begins to surface. Her cruelty was never random. It followed a strategy crafted with unsettling intelligence, one that blended ritual, spectacle, psychological warfare, and calculated silence. Witnesses described her presence as unnervingly calm, as if she carried within her a script that everyone else was forced to perform. And this is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Many of her most notorious acts were not committed in open daylight, but behind walls where power was exercised in ways the official chronicles refused to document. Every sealed corridor, every guarded courtyard seems to hold a missing chapter of her rule. But the question that haunts historians is simple. What did she actually do to her prisoners? The reports that survived are fragmented, contradictory, conveniently incomplete. Some describe elaborate rituals meant to instill terror. Others mention punishments so precise they seem engineered to deliver political messages without leaving visible marks. And then there are the rumors, too persistent to dismiss, too shocking to accept without hesitation, suggesting that the queen used the suffering of captives as a language of control, one understood only by those who dared challenge her authority. Before we move deeper into the labyrinth of secrets surrounding her reign, I want to know something from you. Have you ever encountered a historical figure whose story felt deliberately unfinished, as if someone had carefully hidden the most important parts? Share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding how these shadows were crafted is essential for uncovering what comes next. And while you are here, make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed, so you do not miss the revelations ahead. What we uncover in the next chapter may shift everything you thought you knew about power, fear, and the women who learned to wield both with terrifying precision. The world surrounding the Assassin Queen was not merely unstable. It was engineered by centuries of conflict to reward only those who understood that mercy could be fatal. Her kingdom sat at the crossroads of rival empires, each watching her ascent with a mix of fascination and dread. To the north, a fractured alliance of warlords blamed her family for generations of humiliation. To the south, a rising power coveted her trade routes and viewed her as an obstacle to expansion. Inside the palace walls, things were even more treacherous. Advisors who swore loyalty in public plotted new alliances in secret chambers, and noble families competed for influence with the kind of desperation that could ignite civil war overnight. It is in this atmosphere of constant threat that the queen's transformation becomes clearer. She was not born a tyrant. She was shaped by a political landscape designed to crush anyone too gentle, too trusting, or too slow to retaliate. Her earliest years as a ruler were marked by painful lessons: a close friend who betrayed her, a general who defected to the enemy the night before a decisive battle, a relative who plotted to replace her with a more malleable puppet. Each betrayal burned deeper than the last, and each defeat taught her that the throne was not a seat of honor, but a battlefield where hesitation meant death. Those who later condemned her brutality often ignored that she had first been trained by brutality itself. Yet something else was happening beneath the surface. The queen was not merely responding to threats, she was learning to anticipate them. She studied the patterns of her enemies, mapped the weaknesses of nearby kingdoms, and understood how fear could move armies faster than steel. Her court became a place where information flowed like a hidden river. Spies in foreign markets, infiltrators disguised as traitors, diplomats carrying secret messages stitched into their clothing. Every fragment of intelligence was stored, analyzed, and woven into strategies that no one expected from a woman they had once dismissed as ornamental. This is where her legend takes another turn. Accounts from surviving manuscripts suggest that she developed a political instinct so sharp that it bordered on prophecy. She predicted uprisings months before they formed. She identified traitors before they made their first move. And she sensed the intentions of ambassadors not by their words but by the silence between them. Her decisions grew colder, more precise, shaped by a worldview in which trust was a luxury she could not afford. What outsiders mistook for cruelty was, to her, the only rational path to preserve her throne and prevent her kingdom from collapsing into chaos. But understanding her motivations forces us to confront an unsettling reality. If her violent measures emerged from necessity, where did necessity end and ambition begin? At what moment did she shift from defending her kingdom to shaping it through fear? The chronicles never agree. Some claim she became intoxicated by the power that terror granted her. Others insist she acted only when betrayal was undeniable. And then, there are the forbidden documents, rare, damaged, whispered about by scholars, that hint at a hidden council urging her toward ever harsher methods, a group whose influence remains shrouded in deliberate mystery. These unanswered questions push us toward the shadowed corridors of her palace, toward the unseen machinery of control that defined her rule. And as we step closer to that threshold, the distinction between protector and predator becomes dangerously thin, suggesting that the true horror of her reign may lie not in what she did, but in what she believed she had to do. The deeper you move into the world of the Assassin Queen, the clearer it becomes that becoming her prisoner was rarely a matter of guilt, and almost always a matter of timing. In her kingdom, the boundary between loyalty and treason could shift overnight, shaped by alliances that dissolved as quickly as they formed. Those who eventually found themselves locked behind her stone walls came from every layer of society. Some were high-born nobles who threatened her authority with whispers disguised as political debate. Others were foreign envoys whose negotiations carried hidden agendas. Even members of her personal household were not spared. Servants, tutors, healers, and once trusted confidants all appear in scattered accounts as figures who suddenly vanished from the palace corridors, swallowed by the queen's tightening circle of suspicion. Yet the true nature of becoming a prisoner under her rule went far beyond political misfortune. Her court functioned like an elaborate stage, and being chosen as a target meant entering a performance where every gesture and every word became evidence. Accusations were rarely shouted. Instead, small signals, a lowered gaze, a gesture of hesitation, a pause before answering a question, could be interpreted as signs of secret betrayal. And once the queen believed she detected the faint scent of disloyalty, the path forward was already sealed. What makes this process so chilling is how meticulously it appears to have been orchestrated. Witnesses speak of sudden invitations to private hearings, unexpected summonses in the middle of the night, and letters delivered with a seal that struck instant fear, as everyone knew what receiving such a message implied. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect lies in how ordinary these transformations seemed. A respected general could dine at her table one evening, discussing military reforms with apparent camaraderie, and by Sunrise, he might be escorted through hidden corridors by silent guards, stripped of his status and awaiting judgment in a room lit by a single torch. This fluidity of fate created an atmosphere where trust dissolved into instinctive caution. People spoke in half-sentences, friendships were maintained with forced smiles, and even celebrations had an undercurrent of dread. The Queen used this uncertainty not only to identify threats, but to prevent them from ever forming. Fear became a preemptive weapon, sharper than any blade. Still, understanding how someone became her prisoner requires looking beyond fear and into the intricate system behind it. The Queen kept a network of informants whose identities remain unknown even today. Some were likely coerced, others eager for influence, and a few perhaps motivated by ideological loyalty. These informants fed her a constant stream of micro-observations: who spoke to whom in a corridor, who lingered near the stables at night, who requested access to restricted archives. The palace itself became an observatory, each wall listening, each servant a potential witness. And in this web of surveillance, a single misinterpreted action could spiral into a carefully prepared accusation. This raises an unsettling question that continues to divide historians. How many of her prisoners were truly plotting against her, and how many were merely victims of a system designed to validate her suspicions? The documents do not answer this clearly. Some cases seem justified in context, while others appear rooted in paranoia or political calculation. But the ambiguity is precisely what gives her story its enduring darkness. It suggests that the Queen may have intentionally blurred the line between guilt and innocence, shaping a world where no one could predict with certainty when they might be chosen next. And as these prisoners took their first steps into the inner chambers of her regime, they entered a realm where the rules of ordinary justice no longer applied. A world crafted entirely according to the Queen's vision, one that we are only beginning to uncover. As the prisoners moved deeper into the Queen's domain, they crossed an invisible threshold where fear stopped being a byproduct of power and became a crafted instrument of governance. Public punishment in her kingdom was not merely a spectacle, it was a language. Every gesture, every ritual, every silence held meaning. And the Queen understood this better than anyone. She knew that terror, when performed correctly, could reshape an entire society. What made her approach so distinctive was not the violence itself, but the precision with which it was staged. Her theater of terror, as later historians would call it, blended political messaging with ritual symbolism in a way that kept the population suspended between awe and dread. Those who witnessed these events described scenes orchestrated with unsettling elegance. Prisoners were not dragged through the streets in chaos. They were presented. Processions moved with ceremonial slowness, with guards marching in perfect formation, their armor polished to reflect the harsh sun. The accused were positioned at the center, forced into stillness while the crowd whispered among themselves, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or something far more orchestrated. And always, somewhere above, the Queen watched from a balcony or a hidden window, her presence both distant and overwhelming. She allowed the people to see just enough of her silhouette to remind them who held the final word over their fate. But these performances were not simply about punishing individuals. They were warnings wrapped in rituals. Some punishments were paired with symbols drawn from ancient religious rites, broken branches to represent severed loyalty, bowls of water overturned to signify betrayal, fragments of shattered pottery scattered across the ground, as reminders that once trust was broken, it could never be repaired. Other times, the Queen required confessions to be spoken aloud, not to establish truth, but to reinforce her narrative. Whether those confessions were coerced, fabricated, or genuine hardly mattered. What mattered was that the people heard them, absorbed them, and carried the message back into the city. The Queen saw everything. What often goes unspoken in official chronicles is how effective this strategy was. These public rituals controlled not only behavior, but imagination. People feared being associated with dissent not because of the physical consequences, but because being chosen for the next spectacle meant becoming a symbol of failure, betrayal, or disobedience. The queen used this psychological weight to shape the kingdom's collective consciousness. Even the most powerful nobles found themselves calculating every gesture, every alliance, every glance shared across a banquet table, aware that the queen's gaze extended far beyond what anyone could see. Yet beneath the grandeur of these events, subtle details hint at another layer of intention. Some witnesses noted inconsistencies in how prisoners were treated before presentation, as though their fates were being adjusted behind the scenes. Others claimed that certain processions were staged immediately after political negotiations, suggesting a connection between diplomacy and intimidation. A few rare accounts describe the queen changing a ceremony at the last moment, altering the symbolism based on fresh information gathered from her spies. These clues suggest that her punishments were not rigid rituals but responsive tools, adapted to political necessity in real time. And this opens the door to a question that lingers over her legacy. Were these displays meant to terrify the masses, or were they messages directed at a select audience within the palace? If the latter is true, then the rituals were not simply justice performed in public. They were warnings targeted at those close enough to threaten her power. The more we examine these spectacles, the more they resemble coded communications embedded within fear. Before we move into what truly happened behind the palace walls, I want to hear from you. Which part of this ritualized terror do you think carried the most psychological weight? The symbols, the confessions, or the presence of the queen herself? Share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding this dynamic is crucial for uncovering the darker layers that were never meant to be seen. Once the spectacle ended and the crowds dispersed, the true machinery of the Assassin Queen's power revealed itself in places the public never saw. Behind the fortress walls, past the guarded courtyards and torchlit corridors, her prisoners entered a domain governed by an entirely different set of rules. Here, silence replaced ceremony. The rituals of intimidation that shaped her public image were only surface-level reflections of a deeper, far more calculated system of control that operated in secrecy. What little we know of these hidden practices comes from scattered testimonies, fragmented documents, and accounts whispered by those who narrowly escaped her grasp. Together, they paint a picture of a queen who understood the psychology of fear with unsettling precision. The prisoners rarely arrived alone. They were escorted through winding hallways designed to disorient even those familiar with the palace layout. Architects later speculated that the structure itself functioned as a weapon. Passages bent at unnatural angles, alcoves hid observing guards, and certain steps were deliberately uneven to throw off one's sense of balance. Every detail contributed to a gradual erosion of certainty. By the time a prisoner reached the inner chambers, they no longer trusted their own perception, a vulnerability the queen's interrogators used to devastating effect. But the interrogations themselves were not always brutal in the physical sense. More often, they were psychological contests, carefully engineered to destabilize the prisoner's sense of self. The queen's officials employed strategies that modern scholars might compare to sensory manipulation. Some rooms were kept in near-total darkness, with only the faint echo of dripping water marking the passage of time. Others were flooded with harsh light, forcing the prisoner to squint and making it difficult to distinguish faces. Some chambers were entirely silent, others echoed with distant chanting or muffled footsteps. The unpredictability of these conditions created a pressure that made even the strongest minds fracture. What makes these accounts especially disturbing is how selectively the queen chose to intervene. She did not appear at every interrogation, but when she did, the effect was immediate. Witnesses describe her presence as unnerving not because she raised her voice, but because she hardly spoke at all. Her silence carried an authority that pressed into the room, like a physical force. She would observe the prisoner with calm detachment, as if studying a puzzle whose pieces she already knew how to arrange. This stillness made her more terrifying than any threat. Those who encountered her directly reported feeling as though she saw through their lies, their defenses, and even their intentions. Within these walls, confessions were shaped, not merely extracted. Some prisoners were encouraged to recount their actions in their own words, only to discover that the interrogators already possessed information they did not realize had been leaked. Others were confronted with contradictions designed to unsettle them, forcing them to question what they had actually done versus what they were being accused of. The goal was not simply to uncover truth, it was to break the prisoner's narrative, leaving only the Queen's version intact. But beyond the interrogations lies an even harder question to grasp. What determined who would survive? The records suggest no consistent pattern. Some prisoners were released unexpectedly, their reputations damaged but their bodies intact. Others disappeared with no explanation, their fates sealed in sealed scrolls that never resurfaced. It is possible that the Queen used these outcomes as part of her larger strategy, rewarding those whose broken loyalty could be reshaped and eliminating those whose resistance remained too strong. Yet the most compelling details come from the rare accounts of individuals who survived and later fled the kingdom. Their stories hint that the greatest cruelty was not the fear inflicted, but the sense of uncertainty that lingered long after they left the palace, a psychological imprint crafted by a ruler who understood that the most effective form of power does not end when the door closes. It follows you into the world outside. The glimpses we have into the Queen's hidden world do not come from official chronicles, which were scrubbed clean by generations determined to protect the dynasty's image. Instead, they emerge from the margins, letters smuggled out by terrified scribes, fragments of journals preserved by chance, confessions written by prisoners who believed they would never be heard again. These are not cohesive narratives but shards of memory, each carrying a trace of fear so visceral that even centuries later, the words seem to tremble on the page. And when these pieces are woven together, they reveal a version of the assassin queen that no royal archive ever intended to preserve. One of the most haunting sources is a set of damaged parchment sheets attributed to a palace chronicler who vanished shortly after her reign. His writing is inconsistent, clearly rushed, but a pattern emerges beneath the ink blurs. He describes hearing distant screams at times when the official proclamations claimed no interrogations were taking place. He writes of seeing guards carrying sealed wooden boxes out of the palace at dawn, escorted by priests who chanted low prayers as though trying to cleanse what they accompanied. He mentions corridors abruptly blocked off without explanation, with soldiers posted outside who refused to speak even when offered bribes. These details do not prove anything on their own, but together they suggest activities intentionally hidden from public view. Even more unsettling are the personal letters written by nobles who once attended the Queen's court. Many of these letters were discovered in private family archives generations later, their contents never meant for outside eyes. One noblewoman described a night when the Queen summoned her to a private chamber to discuss a diplomatic arrangement. As the conversation unfolded, the noblewoman noticed faint marks on the stone floor, circular patterns carved so precisely that they appeared ceremonial. When she asked about them, the Queen simply smiled and changed the subject. Another noble wrote of hearing chanting beneath the palace during a visit, though no official religious ceremonies were scheduled at the time. He recalled an unease he could not explain, as if the air itself resisted being breathed. The most disturbing accounts, however, come from the rare individuals who survived imprisonment and managed to escape the kingdom. Their testimonies vary in detail, but converge in emotion. One former advisor, exiled after confessing to crimes he insisted were fabricated, claimed that the Queen used silence as a form of torture. She would stand in the doorway of the interrogation room without speaking, waiting until the prisoner broke under the weight of her presence alone. Another survivor, a foreign envoy, described being forced to repeat his story so many times that he began to doubt his own memory. By the end, he said, he could no longer distinguish between what he had done and what he had been accused of. What makes these testimonies even more complex is how they contradict each other. Some portray the queen as a tyrant, intoxicated by cruelty. Others insist she was cold, controlled, and purposeful, using suffering only as a calculated instrument. A handful even claim she expressed pity toward certain prisoners, though whether this was genuine compassion or another layer of manipulation remains impossible to determine. The contradictions do not diminish their value. They reveal that the queen adapted her methods to the individual before her, shaping each experience into whatever form best served her political strategy. Historians have long debated the authenticity of these sources. Some documents show signs of later modification, possibly altered to support propaganda campaigns by rival factions. Others appear genuine but lack corroboration. But the most compelling evidence lies in their consistency. Across dozens of unrelated accounts, the same motifs appear again and again. Hidden chambers, carefully orchestrated interrogations, rituals that blurred the line between justice and performance, and a ruler whose presence alone could unravel even the strongest minds. And it is in these fragments that the contours of her true power begin to surface, leading us deeper into the network of advisors, priests, and enforcers who enabled her reign from the shadows. If the forbidden testimonies reveal the brutality of the queen's hidden world, the next layer exposes something even more unsettling. She did not act alone. Power on her scale is never solitary. Behind every command she issued stood a network of advisors, priests, and enforcers whose loyalty formed the spine of her regime. Understanding them is essential, because they were not merely accomplices. They were architects of influence, each shaping the queen's decisions in ways history nearly erased. And yet, the deeper we examine their roles, the clearer it becomes that none of them truly controlled her. They operated within an ecosystem she designed, one where allegiance was constantly tested and fear circulated like blood through the veins of the palace. The advisors were the most visible part of this machinery. They sat beside her during councils, offered strategies, mediated alliances, and delivered information gathered through the kingdom's sprawling intelligence network. But proximity to power was a dangerous privilege. Many advisors discovered too late that their counsel was being evaluated not by its usefulness alone, but by the intentions behind it. The queen was known to ask the same question in different meetings, measuring whether the answers shifted according to political winds. Those whose advice wavered, even subtly, were replaced with unsettling speed. Some advisors disappeared without explanation. Others were reassigned to distant provinces where their influence dissolved in silence. This constant reshuffling maintained a balance of fear and ambition that prevented any single advisor from gaining too much control. Then, there were the priests, whose presence in the palace was more pervasive than the chronicles admit. Their rituals shaped the ideological foundations of the queen's rule. They interpreted omens, consecrated decisions, and infused political actions with a layer of divine legitimacy. But their power was not merely religious. Some priests served as intermediaries between the queen and the darkest traditions of the realm, customs rooted in ancestral beliefs that blurred the line between ceremony and intimidation. A few testimonies suggest that certain rituals performed around the prisoners had symbolic origins predating the kingdom itself, woven into a tapestry of myths, sacrifices, and sacred punishments. Whether these rituals were genuine spiritual practices or carefully crafted political tools remains part of the mystery. Yet the most feared members of her inner circle were the enforcers. These were not simple guards or soldiers. They were specialists trained in observation, interrogation, and containment. Their loyalty bordered on fanaticism. Many had spent years under the Queen's mentorship, learning to interpret subtle cues in her expression, adjusting their actions to her unspoken will. Witnesses described them moving through the palace with chilling efficiency, carrying out orders without hesitation, retrieving information before it was requested, and removing obstacles before they became visible. Some accounts even suggest that the Queen allowed rivalries among her enforcers, using competition to sharpen their dedication and prevent them from forming alliances outside her control. But the true genius of this system lies in how she manipulated the structure itself. Every advisor knew they were being watched. Every priest understood their influence depended on her favor. Every enforcer realized loyalty was a temporary currency, constantly reevaluated. This dynamic created an environment where survival required absolute commitment, and where betrayal, real or imagined, could reshape the hierarchy overnight. The Queen fostered this tension deliberately, ensuring that her network remained powerful but fractured, loyal but dependent, dangerous but predictable. And this leads to a question that scholars still debate today. Did these individuals strengthen her power, or did she strengthen theirs? The answer seems to lie somewhere in between. She surrounded herself with people who were indispensable yet replaceable, influential yet vulnerable. They were the gears that turned her empire, but she was the force that kept those gears aligned, fueled, and spinning. Without her, the machinery collapsed. Without them, her reign would have lacked the shadowy precision that made her infamous. Before we go further into the final transformation of her legacy, I want to hear from you. Which figure do you believe held the most sway in her court? The advisors, the priests, or the enforcers? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, especially if one of these roles feels more crucial or more dangerous than the others. In the centuries that followed the Assassin Queen's death, her legacy became a battlefield, as contested as the territory she once ruled. Every faction that rose after her, rival dynasties, religious institutions, foreign empires, reformist intellectuals, had something to gain or lose from the way her story was told. And so, her memory became clay, reshaped again and again to fit the needs of those who assumed power. What survived to the present is not a single narrative, but a mosaic of distortions, each revealing less about who she truly was and more about the forces that tried to control her image. The first to manipulate her legacy were her own successors. They inherited a kingdom stabilized through fear, but they lacked her charisma and strategic precision. To legitimize their rule, they needed to distance themselves from the methods that had secured their throne. The most effective way to do this was simple: portray her as an aberration, a ruler whose brutality exceeded all boundaries. They commissioned new chronicles emphasizing her excesses and highlighting her supposed instability, painting her as a cautionary tale rather than a political foundation. Under their guidance, scribes rewrote rituals as atrocities, political maneuvers as madness, and strategic interrogations as uncontrolled cruelty. Whether these embellishments were honest condemnations or calculated distortions is a question scholars still debate. Religious authorities soon joined this effort. During her reign, the Queen had used selective collaboration with priests to strengthen her power, but she also maintained spiritual independence that made her difficult to control. After her death, institutions seeking to consolidate influence reframed her as a ruler who defied divine order. They depicted her rituals as blasphemous reinterpretations of sacred practices, and her interrogations as ceremonies tainted by forbidden symbols. Temple archives quietly removed records of her donations, her reforms, and her alliances, replacing them with stories portraying her as a threat to spiritual purity. Some inscriptions originally praising her devotion were scraped clean and recarved with condemnations, an erasure both symbolic and literal. Foreign powers added their own layers of distortion. Kingdoms that had once feared her military decisions now portrayed her as a tyrant whose cruelty justified their wars against her. Ambassadors who had negotiated under the weight of her presence later recast those meetings as encounters with a ruler driven by unrestrained violence. These accounts circulated widely, validating invasions, territorial claims, or shifts in diplomatic relationships. The more these narratives spread, the harder it became to separate political propaganda from historical truth. Even scholars of later centuries contributed to the confusion, though unintentionally. Fascinated by her reputation, some romanticized her as a misunderstood genius whose brilliance frightened weaker rulers. Others reduced her to a caricature of female ambition, using her as an example of what happens when women wield power without restraint. Their writings, though based on research, were inevitably colored by the biases of their time, reinforcing the most sensational elements of her legend while ignoring its nuance. And yet, despite all these manipulations, fragments of her authentic story persisted. Hidden in private archives, buried beneath palatial ruins, encoded in oral traditions passed through families who once served her, these remnants resist complete erasure. They paint a portrait far more complex than either the tyrant or the icon some wished her to become. They suggest a ruler who mastered fear not because she enjoyed cruelty, but because her survival required it. They reveal strategies rooted in intelligence rather than bloodlust, rituals shaped by political necessity rather than spiritual darkness. And they hint at a woman who understood that controlling her legacy would be her final and perhaps most difficult battle. But the rewriting of her history also raises an uncomfortable question. If so many hands shaped her story after her death, how much of what we believe about her was crafted not by her actions, but by those who feared the consequences of remembering her accurately? The more we examine these distortions, the closer we come to understanding not just her reign, but the people who needed her to be either monster or martyr. As her legacy was reshaped over time, something intriguing emerged in the historical record. The Assassin Queen was not the only powerful woman whose story morphed into a moral warning. Across ancient and medieval civilizations, female rulers, regents, and military leaders were often remembered not for their political achievements, but for the fear they supposedly inspired. The pattern is so consistent, so repetitive, that historians now question whether some of these women were truly monstrous, or whether they became vessels for society's anxieties about female authority. Examining this wider landscape sheds new light on the Queen herself, revealing the cultural forces that may have amplified or distorted her reputation. Consider the case of a neighboring kingdom's queen who ruled a generation before her. Contemporary sources describe her as bold and strategic, securing alliances that protected her realm from invasion. Yet, within a century of her death, stories emerged depicting her as a seductress who manipulated male rulers through dark rituals and poisoned chalices. Another example comes from a distant empire, where a female general led victorious campaigns along the frontier. Her tactical brilliance won battles her male predecessors had repeatedly lost. Still, later chronicles reframed her as a brutal warmonger, claiming she reveled in bloodshed and sacrificed prisoners to ancient gods. These accounts, though widely accepted for centuries, now appear suspiciously similar in tone and structure to the stories later told about the Assassin Queen. Even spiritual leaders were not immune. In one isolated civilization, a high priestess known for reforming corrupt temple practices was later depicted as an agent of chaos, accused of summoning spirits to bend the population to her will. The contrast between her administrative reforms and the lurid details of later legends reveals a familiar dynamic. When women disrupted established power structures, their enemies often relied on narrative warfare to reclaim dominance. Demonizing these figures served a dual purpose. It punished their legacy and reinforced the idea that female authority was inherently dangerous, needing to be contained or corrected. This broader pattern complicates our understanding of the Assassin Queen. It suggests that at least part of her reputation may have been shaped by the same cultural mechanisms that vilified other influential women. Yet it would be simplistic to blame her entire legend on misogyny alone. Unlike many of these other figures, the Queen's rule undeniably involved fear, punishment, and calculated brutality. What makes her case unique is how these actions intersect with the biases of her time. Where male rulers could employ terror and be remembered as strong or decisive, female rulers who used similar tactics were transformed into cautionary myths. The question becomes not whether she was ruthless, evidence suggests she was, but how much of her supposed monstrosity was amplified to fit expectations. This intersection between reality and myth is further complicated by political necessity. For her enemies, portraying her as a villain justified rebellion, invasion, or propaganda campaigns. For her successors, exaggerating her cruelty helped them appear more virtuous. For moralists and religious leaders, she became an example used to illustrate the dangers of disorder. For later storytellers, she offered a dramatic figure, whose life could be molded into parables or legends. Over time, these layers accumulated until the real woman was buried beneath the versions crafted by others. And yet, something remarkable happens when you strip away the distortions and examine the surviving fragments closely. A different image begins to emerge, one of a ruler shaped by extreme circumstances, making decisions in a world where violence was the currency of survival. Her actions may have been harsher than those of her male contemporaries, but they were not unprecedented. What made her unforgettable was the combination of her gender, her intelligence, and the terror she commanded with such precision. These qualities made her an anomaly in the historical record, and anomalies often invite exaggeration. As we approach the final layer of her story, one thing becomes clear. The Assassin Queen did not simply inherit a legacy of fear. She became the focal point of a broader societal struggle over who is allowed to wield power, how that power is interpreted, and how memory itself becomes a tool in the hands of the victors. And it is within this confrontation between truth and myth that we begin to glimpse the deeper meaning behind her reign. The final puzzle piece in understanding the Assassin Queen is not found in the brutality she displayed or the myths constructed around her, but in what her story reveals about the nature of power itself. She lived in a world where authority was maintained through fear, alliances were forged through necessity, and narratives were shaped by those who survived long enough to tell them. Her reign forces us to confront the possibility that history is not a record of what happened, but a reflection of who controlled the pen. And when the pen passes through the hands of those who feared her, envied her, or sought to erase her, the truth becomes a battlefield as contested as any she once ruled. Yet what lingers beneath the surface is not just the echo of violence, but a question that challenges the foundations of historical memory. How much of her legacy belonged to her, and how much belonged to the world that needed her to embody certain expectations? If she had been a man, would her tactics have been interpreted differently? Would her strategies have been lauded as bold statecraft rather than condemned as cruelty? The contradictions in the surviving accounts hint that the line between villain and visionary was drawn after her death, not during her life. And this, more than anything, exposes the fragility of the stories we trust. What makes her especially haunting is the way her shadow persists long after the details have faded. Even centuries later, scholars cannot agree whether she was a tyrant, a strategist, or a survivor shaped by the violence of her era. Some argue that she simply mastered the tools her world rewarded. Others believe she redefined the boundaries of female authority in ways her contemporaries could neither understand nor accept. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these extremes, a ruler navigating the chaos of her time with a mix of calculated terror and unshakable resolve, leaving behind a legacy both feared and misunderstood. But there is something undeniably magnetic about examining figures like her. They force us to confront uncomfortable aspects of human nature. How power can twist morality, how narratives can be weaponized, how memory can be sculpted into truth. Her story shows that the darkest chapters of history are often the ones most carefully edited, and as new discoveries continue to surface, ruins excavated, manuscripts decoded, fragments reinterpreted, we begin to see the outline of a woman who refused to fit the roles assigned to her. Whether she embraced brutality out of necessity or desire may never be fully known, but her impact remains carved into the foundations of the world she shaped. In the end, exploring her reign becomes less about judging her actions and more about understanding the forces that molded her, the enemies who feared her, and the generations who reimagined her. And perhaps that is why her story endures. Not because of the cruelty she displayed, but because of the questions she left behind. Questions about who gets to define power, who deserves to wield it, and how the truth can be distorted until it resembles myth more than memory. If you made it here, it means this story resonated with you on some level. Before you go, let me ask for something simple. Leave a comment saying, "I stayed with you until the end," so I know you walked through this entire journey. And if this exploration gave you a new perspective on history, make sure you are subscribed and drop a like as a way of telling the algorithm that stories like this matter. There is another video waiting right here beside this one, diving even deeper into the shadows of the past. Click and continue with me into the next chapter of this world where power, fear, and memory intertwine in ways we are still trying to understand.